Hello and welcome to this video lecture for the University of Connecticut's online course, Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies 1103, Classical Mythology. I'm Roger Travis, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Connecticut, and whether you're enrolled in this course or not, I hope you enjoy the lecture and learn something about new ways of looking at classics and at myth. Thanks for watching.
My favorite way into just how clever Odysseus's shaping of his adventures in the apologue comes when we look closely at the advice that Circe gives to Odysseus about his voyage homeward. This is after Odysseus has returned to Circe's island from the land of the dead, and so this is the final advice that Circe gives to him. It's towards the very end of the apologue, and it has to do with what I think are probably the two most famous monsters, perhaps in all of Western culture, but definitely in the Odyssey, and the monsters are Scylla and Charybdis. It's an incredible image that we all know very well. One horrible monster on one side, another horrible monster on the other side. It's impossible, Circe says explicitly, to get through without losing anybody, so Odysseus has to make his choice of how he's going to do it, and he decides, as Circe advises him to, in the end, to go closer to Scylla and lose the men to Scylla rather than losing everybody to Charybdis. So it's a very evocative and memorable story. But when you look closely at it, I'm going to suggest there's something that's really quite strange about it, which is a clue to what's actually going on in the adventures, the apologue as a whole. We're in Book 12 at line 55. Circe's talking. Then, for the first time, when your companions have driven you past them, for that time I will no longer tell you in detail which way of the two your course must lie, but you yourself must consider this in your own mind. I will tell you the two ways of it. On one side there are overhanging rocks, and against them crashes the heavy swell of dark-eyed Amphitrite. The blessed gods call these rocks the rovers. By this way not even any flying thing, not even the tremulous doves which carry ambrosia to Zeus the Father can pass through. But every time the sheer rock catches away one even of these, but the Father then adds another to keep the number right. No ship of men that came here ever has fled through, but the waves of the sea and storms of the ravening fire carry away together the ship's timbers and the men's bodies. That way the only sea-going ship to get through was Argo, who is in all men's minds, on her way home from Aeetes, and even she would have been driven on the great rocks that time, but Hera saw her through, out of her great love for Jason. But of the two rocks one reaches up into the wide heaven with a pointed peak, and a dark cloud stands always around it, and never at any time draws away from it, nor does the sunlight ever hold that peak either in the early or the late summer, nor could any man who was mortal climb there or stand mounted on the summit, not if he had 20 hands and 20 feet, for the rock goes sheerly up as if it were polished. Halfway up the cliff there is a cave, misty-looking and turned toward Erebus and the dark, the very direction from which, O shining Odysseus, you and your men will be steering your hollow ship. And from the hollow ship no vigorous young man with a bow could shoot to the hole in the cliffside. In that cavern Scylla lives, whose howling is terror. So Circe goes on to tell more about Scylla and then about Charybdis, but we've already got the part that's the most important part, I think, maybe in the entire apologue for figuring out what's going on here. And that's when Circe begins the description of Scylla and Charybdis by talking unexpectedly about the Argo, Jason's ship. Because, bizarrely enough, Scylla and Charybdis, the two most famous monsters of Odysseus' adventures, are located in the very same rocks through which the Argo famously went, the rocks which Circe in this account calls the rovers, but which are elsewhere known as the Symplegades, the clashy together things, the rocks that Jason's ship just managed to get through, as Circe tells us, and at the same time tells us that the Argo is basemelusa, a care to all. That means an old story, a story that everybody knows, as your translator Lattimore translates, who is in all men's minds. Here's what's going on. Odysseus, and behind Odysseus, the bard of Book 12 of the Odyssey, has taken the very well-known In fact, so well known that it's become old hat, story of Jason and the Argo and the Argonauts, and reshaped it for Odysseus's purposes right here in his tales to the Phaeacians. Odysseus is saying to the Phaeacians, and the bard of Book 12 is saying to his audience, look, I know that that story about the Argo isn't very exciting anymore, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to make it much more exciting, and in the process, I, Odysseus, and I, the bard of Book 12, am going to come up with the two most exciting monsters you've ever met in your entire life. Odysseus' story, that is more exciting than the old hat story about the Argo. Now, there are reasons, as I talk about in another lecture, why the story of the Argo would be so ripe for this kind of treatment, the kind of treatment that says, oh, you don't want to hear about that old boring story, do you? But what's more important for our present purposes is to figure out why exactly Scylla and Charybdis get put in there at that moment. What is it about Scylla and Charybdis that make them perfect for Odysseus to put into the Symplegades to make his story exactly the kind of kleos that is going to get him the nostos that he wants? And that's where the true genius of the apologue comes in, because Scylla and Charybdis have one thing that's very much in common between them. They're both eating dangers. In both cases, the threat that they pose is of eating Odysseus and his men. And when we notice that, we also start to notice how so many of the dangers that Odysseus faces in the apologue are, in one way or another, eating dangers. Even those bizarre Lystrygonians who seemed like they were just kind of regular giants for a while, all of a sudden turn out to be cannibals. The Cyclopes are cannibals. Circe turns Odysseus' men into pigs who can only think about eating. On the island of the cattle of the sun, the problem is you have to not eat the cattle or else you're going to die. Even the lotus eaters, when you think about it, are themselves an eating danger. Odysseus, it seems, and the bards of the apologue are fundamentally concerned with figuring out how to do the right kind of eating. Not like Scylla and Charybdis eating, not like lotus eaters eating, not like Cyclopes eating, not like eating the cattle of the sun, but the right kind of eating that will keep you alive and eventually get you home the way you want to get home. Now, there's a punchline here, but I'm going to save that punchline until after I bring in a modern comparison with one of my favorite comedies of all time, and that will be in the next segment.